this deep dive of ours today. And it is a really controversial title. It's going to, I hope, draw a few clicks to our page. Amadeus Was Wrong. I don't know if you've seen the play, if you've seen the film Amadeus, but oh my goodness me, it doesn't paint dear Signor Salieri in a good light at all. You do, I suppose, at the end of both the film and certainly the play, feel a sense of sympathy for Salieri to some extent, but he doesn't come out of it very well at all. His reputation is rather tarnished. And it's very fair to say it wasn't actually the fault of Peter Shaffer, who wrote the play, because these rumours have been circulating since the start of the 1800s, really. You know, Salieri's reputation was already under threat before he died. So let's find out why. But first of all, let's find out a bit more about the man himself. So let's dive in, everyone. Here he is. This is Signor Salieri, and he was an Italian, as you can probably tell by the name. He was born in 1750, and he died in 1825. Now, those of you that are followers of the deep dives will instantly spot that's a good long life for one of these composers. A little bit like Gluck last week. You know, these two chaps actually lived a decent chunk of time, unlike poor old Pergolesi, who died in his 20s, and Schubert, who died in his early 30s, and Mozart, indeed, who died just at the age of 34. Now, Salieri was a composer, as I'm sure we can all probably gather, but he was also an important conductor, and most importantly, he was a teacher. And that's going to keep coming back. The fact that he was a teacher is going to be one of the key aspects to his life and to his legacy. And it's in fact is this part of Salieri's life that I think we should be most grateful for, because his life as a teacher had an impact on some of the greatest composers we've ever seen. And when you find out some of the names, I mean, when I was researching this, I discovered some names that I had no idea he taught so-and-so, and I actually gasped in one case. Now, he was born just south of Verona and grew up as a subject of the Habsburg monarchy, and that's important because he ended up in the imperial court. But he didn't start there. He started as a young musician. He showed promise from an early age, as they often do, but he was orphaned at a young age. He was only 12 when he lost both his parents. He went on to become one of the most important composers of his age. He inherited the mantle of opera pioneer from Gluck, who was actually one of his mentors. And he went on to shape and develop many of the features that we take for granted in the modern operatic vocabulary, if you like. But he was first taught music at home by his older brother. Francesco Salieri, a picture of him here, and his older brother was a former student of the composer and violinist Tartini. Some of you might have heard some of Tartini's concertos, which are rather lovely. And Salieri received further instruction in music from the organist of the local cathedral. And so those early musical experiences were very formative. Salieri lived long enough to be interviewed, to have his not his life story captured really by several biographers. And Salieri himself remembered very little of his childhood, other than he was passionate about several things: sugar, reading, and music. Sounds like my children. He twice ran away from home to hear his elder brother play violin concertos in neighbouring churches on festival days. And when he was brought home, he was punished by losing his beloved sugar. And he remembers being chastised by his father for being less than cordial to a priest, who he, when asked, why was he rude to this priest, he responded by saying that the priest's organ playing had offended him because it wasn't appropriate. It was an inappropriately theatrical style, which I think is quite funny when you consider that Salieri went on to become one of the foremost composers of opera, that is to say, theatrical music. But he was always about the prim and proper and the right thing to say at the right time. Now, As I've already said, Salieri's parents died when he was very young, so he found himself an orphan and penniless. He was taken in by several kind benefactors, including a Franciscan monk who looked after him for a couple of years and who encouraged his musical development. At the age of 16, penniless, destitute, he was taken in by the imperial court composer Herr Gassmann, who took him to Vienna and introduced him to Emperor Joseph II. Now, this really is an example of it's not what you know, it's who you know. Salieri had clearly impressed Herr Gassmann, and this allowed him to gain access to the highest echelons of music, the court of the emperor. And during this same period, Salieri also fostered friendships with Gluck, as I've already mentioned. And if you haven't seen last week's deep dive on Gluck, well, do watch it. Gluck was an immensely important composer for his developments in opera, and he took the young Salieri under his wing. Saw a fellow composer, also a fellow wanderer, someone who had lost his way, who needed support. And so both Gassmann and Gluck looked after Salieri, didn't charge him for any education, understood that he was a penniless orphan with a huge amount of potential and looked after him. That's important. That comes back later on. When Salieri was 20, his first opera was performed in Vienna, and 4 years later he found himself the court composer of the emperor himself. And in 1788, at the age of 38, he was made the Hofkapellmeister, which is to say the master of the emperor's chapel, which is really the highest musical position in the land. And Salieri held that position for 36 years. Now, this really is, it's not quite a job for life, as we'll discover, but to have arisen from such humble beginnings and to rise to that position of really in charge of all of the emperor's music meant he was a musician of great influence, of great power, and really of high prestige. His reputation was absolutely golden. Now, during his official career, he composed operas not just for theatres in Austria, but also for further afield in France and in Italy. In 1783, he met and became a frequent collaborator with a chap called Lorenzo da Ponte, who was an important lyricist. And those of you who are Mozart fans will recognize the name da Ponte, because he wrote many of the libretti for Mozart's operas, including Don Giovanni. And interestingly, Salieri's best-known opera was the French opera Tartare, which was translated into Italian and really was performed all around Europe and was received far better by the Viennese public than Mozart's Don Giovanni. Interestingly, Don Giovanni was premiered in Prague and was a huge success. Even to this day, if you go to Prague, if you want to see an opera, chances are it's going to be Don Giovanni. They absolutely loved it. They still do. But Vienna never really took to Mozart's operas. It's a tragedy in a way, but I think that the conservative Viennese tastes were far more into Salieri's style than Mozart's style. We'll talk about Mozart and his style in a little bit, but it seems that Mozart was quite a volatile character, and that volatility tended to spill over into his music. It's one of the things I think that appeals to us as an audience several hundred years later. This volatility creates a sense of brilliance and unexpected wonder, whereas Salieri's music was relatively predictable. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but didn't have that same sense of inspiration and danger, I suppose, that Mozart did. As I've already said, Salieri became an incredibly important teacher, and he started teaching really from as soon as he arrived in Vienna and established himself as the premier instructor, particularly in vocal technique and counterpoint. So here's a little example of some of his music here. You can find all sorts of Salieri's scores. What I really appreciate about Salieri's scores is, unlike the scores of Handel, of Beethoven in particular, and to some extent Mozart, Salieri's scores are very neat, very tidy. Beethoven's are covered with all sorts of scrawls. Handel's, as you know, sometimes you've got spilt ink and oil drip from lamps and so on. Mozart, even the great Mozart, his scores are covered with crossings out and so on. Salieri was meticulous and took his time and was very, very neat. Now, all of this is very nice, but you're all here to find out one thing. Is this accurate? And of course, this isn't actually Salieri, although they did a good job of finding somebody who looks quite a lot like him. This is the great F. Murray Abraham in the immortal film from 1984, Amadeus. And the film itself was based on a play by Peter Shaffer, and the play itself was based on all sorts of other material that had been produced in the centuries leading up to it. So it wasn't as if Shaffer plucked this idea from the air. Really, from Mozart's death, there was this underlying controversy, this question, how did he die? He was so young. And there was this supposed rivalry between Salieri and Mozart. Let's address the elephant in the room. And interestingly, this idea has gone beyond the world of music. I'll never forget sitting in the cinema as a teenager watching a film with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it where this controversy arose. Let me just show you the scene I mean.
This is top secret.
I know the Vivaldi mob is joining forces with the Torellis.
Damn it, Jack, how do you do that?
Well, I'm not parked behind the desk all day eating those donuts.
As a government donuts, my friend, it's not easy work. I gotta call DC.
Good for you.
Watch it, Jack. He killed Mozart.
There you are. He killed Mozart. I mean, sure enough, later on in the film, the F. Murray Abraham character turns out to be a bad guy. And Schwarzenegger says to him, I should have guessed. I was told you killed Mozart. And he said, Mo who? Zart, says Schwarzenegger. It's a lovely little scene. Did Salieri kill Mozart? I'm sorry to burst the bubble, ladies and gentlemen. No, he didn't. He did not kill Mozart. Mozart did not die by poisoning. Interestingly, Mozart said to his wife, as he wasn't feeling very well in the summer before he died, that he thought he'd been given aqua tofana, but we do know that was almost certainly a joke. Okay, aqua tofana was a poison that had been created by women who wanted to kill their husbands, and we think that this was Mozart's way of poking fun at his wife. He actually felt quite a lot better as the summer progressed. And reading various books and so on written by medical professionals in the last few years, it seems that Mozart died, I'm going to have to read this because I'm not medical, died of a streptococcal infection, which progressed to a swelling and dysfunction of the kidneys, which killed him ultimately in December of 1791. So Salieri did not kill Mozart. And interestingly, although the film suggests that Salieri put on this mask and commissioned the Requiem and so on, we know that's not the case. We know that a local count commissioned the Requiem for Mozart, intending to pass it off as his own and so on. So that's two of the myths dispelled straight away. Now, Diane wrote to me very kindly a couple of days ago and pointed out that in the play, Salieri actually says, I love the fact that this rumour has arisen that I killed Mozart. Let me find the quote that Diane very kindly sent to us. Bear with me a second. It's on my phone here. Here we go. So Salieri decides to claim it was his act in order to associate his name forever with Mozart, so he wouldn't sink into oblivion as the lesser musician. I've one trick left me. I've been shouting about murder, and now my name is on everyone's tongue. They will believe the lie forever, and I shall live on, if not in fame, then in infamy. So that's a rough quote. Thank you to Diane for sending that in. Now, it is fictional, obviously. The play, the film, and all of these rumours are all taken from really gossip, ladies and gentlemen. Let's dig into it. Let's go even deeper. Let's dive deep into this. Were they rivals, everyone? Were they rivals? Well, even that's quite unlikely. From what we can gather, there was certainly some animosity from Mozart towards Salieri, but that was very much a case of jealousy. Salieri was in the top chair. He was sat next to the emperor. He was in the top musical spot in Vienna, and it was a position that Mozart felt he deserved. We know from his writings, he didn't mention Salieri by name, but he used to complain to his father, he complained to his wife, that the Italian influence in court was so great he couldn't get any traction. His works couldn't be performed as often as he wanted. So he found his operas didn't take very well with the Viennese audience. But whether that means he disliked Salieri, there really is very little evidence of it. The two men were colleagues, and from what we can tell, they respected each other. They collaborated on music together. There's a piece we found called Per la recuperata salute di Ophelia, for the recovered health of Ophelia, which celebrates an English singer. It's not a very good piece, but they worked on it together. Now, these rumours of the rivalry between the composers really arose from the early days of them meeting in the 1770s, given that Salieri was the court composer and Wolfgang, who was 5 years younger than him, and very much the sort of the young buck wanting to come in and prove himself. But no, there's not enough evidence to suggest that they were even rivals. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that actually they were friends. Salieri was seen to grieve openly at Mozart's funeral, and later on he was asked by Constanza, Mozart's wife, to become the music teacher and tutor to Franz Xavier Mozart, that is Mozart's son. So really, if these accusations had any merit, you really think that Constanza would have asked someone who had been rivals to Mozart to teach the Mozart Jr.? I doubt that very, very, very much. So how did these rumours start? Well, the first documentation of these rumours took place in 1803. That's the first time we see it written down anywhere. And interestingly, in 1809, at one of the premieres of one of Beethoven's symphonies, an anonymous pamphlet was handed out with an engraving and text underneath suggesting that Salieri had forced Mozart to drink from a poisoned cup. And this really does show the power of the media to influence people. From there, bearing in mind Salieri was still around and was only, 60 at that point. These rumours started to swirl and became part of the public discourse. Now, as I say, there was no evidence of it, but all it took was some carefully produced pamphlets handed out at the right time in the right place for Salieri's reputation to take a hit. Now, these rumours got an unfortunate boost in 1823. Bear in mind that Salieri died in 1825. He, in his last couple of years, he fell quite badly to dementia and ended up in care. And in 1823, he attempted suicide. And during the attempt, perhaps, and we think in a completely deranged state of mind, and I think having been pushed through years and years and years of hearing whispers and being accused of something he didn't do, he apparently confessed to the murder. Now, later on, when he was lucid, he completely recanted anything he said. He said, "I can say in good faith, there is no truth to the absurd rumour that I poisoned Mozart." And in fact, his servants who'd been with him throughout the entire episode said that they'd never heard him confess, so we don't know where this supposed confession came from. But really, if there was any truth to any of it, it may well have been that Salieri, as a prominent musician with a lot of power and a lot of influence, might have felt threatened by Mozart. There is no denying that Mozart was a superior composer, and Salieri, in a position to perhaps encourage or keep down this young pretender, may well have had an opportunity to brush a few of his operas off. Mozart suggested that Salieri had blocked access to him teaching a prominent princess, which would have been an important source of income, and so on. And so, in truth, Mozart was no real threat to Salieri. Salieri had no motive to kill Mozart, and really they had nothing but congenial relations, and they were I don't want to say they were friends, because they were in many senses rivals, but I don't think Salieri had anything to do with his death. Constanza later publicly said that Mozart's death was due to illness and overwork. She was well aware of the accusations, but never commented on them. And as I said, she even allowed Salieri to teach the young Mozart. Really odd thing to do if she believed the rumours. And one of the lovely little notes here is that someone who came out fighting for Salieri and wrote very much in his defence was Beethoven, who was one of Salieri's students and one of his closest friends. Now, let's take a step back from that controversy and let's talk about Salieri the teacher, because there's been enough words written about whether or not he killed Mozart. I think we can say quite safely he didn't kill Mozart. In fact, he was Mozart's friend and he was a supporter of the great composer. And where did that influence come from? Well, although Salieri was clearly, from what we can understand, a very shrewd, cunning individual, he got where he got through hard work, but also with being a politician and knowing how to get on with people. But he maintained a really kind heart throughout his life, particularly towards his students. And a lot of that, we think, came from Herr Gassmann, who I've spoken about, and Gluck here, who took him under his wing and made him one of his students. And Gluck's considerable innovations in Italian opera really inspired Salieri and gave him those vital skills to perfect his style. And as an Italian, obviously, we're talking about Italian opera, he had the name, he had the background, he was in the perfect position to rise to the top job. Now, later on, long after Mozart died, about 12 years after Mozart died, Salieri retired from the stage. He stopped writing operas and focused entirely on writing sacred music and with a few secular pieces. Interestingly, this was very much down to a good sense of timing on his part, bearing in mind that he was in the late third of his life. He had lived long enough to see styles change, and at the beginning of the 19th century, well, things were changing rapidly. Artistic styles were changing, were moving away from a focus on patrons and on the aristocracy, and starting to move towards more revolutionary ideals and the Enlightenment. And he saw that his own liberal political views, which had been very closely allied with Emperor Joseph, who himself was quite a liberal emperor, if such a thing can be said, he started to see more radical ideas coming in, particularly with the French invasion of Austria, which was brutal, and he saw a lot of death and he saw a lot of tragedy, combined with the fact that he himself he lost his wife and only son in 1807, both hugely tragic events, combined with the overrunning of the city in which he was living, really put the kibosh on his joy of writing opera, and he focused exclusively on writing sacred music for the rest of his life. He said, and here's a quote, he spoke of the radical changes in the musical taste at the start of the 19th century. From around 1800, I realized that musical taste was gradually changing in a manner completely contrary to that of my own times. Eccentricity and confusion of genres replaced reasoned and masterful simplicity. So what he's talking about there, ladies and gentlemen, is the Romantic era. And he felt he had no place in that new style. That was very much a human, emotion-led style, and his musical background was in structure and form, everything in its place. Now, I've mentioned the fact that he was a great teacher, and it may surprise you to know that he was hugely admired and appreciated by many of the great composers. He, as well as a teacher, he was also a conductor, as I've discussed. He conducted many pieces by Haydn, including the famous performance of The Creation, which Haydn collapsed. He was a teacher of Ludwig van Beethoven and conducted many of the premieres of Beethoven's works. Beethoven was not regarded as a conductor, and particularly as his hearing started to go. Salieri here conducted the premieres of the first and second piano concertos and Wellington's Victory. He was a teacher of Franz Schubert, as we've already discussed in a previous deep dive, and he was also a teacher of Franz Liszt. Most of these instruction sessions were on vocal music, but all of these composers referred to Salieri's influence as being hugely influential and hugely positive. And these are just the famous names that he worked with. He worked with hundreds of young musicians, often giving his services for free, because he remembered the importance of that early influence and that early education that he received from Gassmann and from Gluck, when they had known him as a penniless orphan, and that influence had helped him rise to the position that he was in. Now, as I already mentioned, in the last couple of years of his life, Salieri was committed to mental care. He suffered dementia for the last year and a half of his life. He died aged 74 in May of 1825 and was buried in Vienna. At his own memorial service, they premiered his Requiem for the very first time. We're going to be listening to a little bit of it in a minute. And you can find his grave here in the Zentralfriedhof in Vienna. And the monument is adorned by a poem written by Joseph Weigel, one of his pupils, and translated, it's "Rest in peace. uncovered by dust, eternity shall bloom for you. Rest in peace, in eternal harmonies, your spirit now is set free. It expressed itself in enchanting notes. Now it's floating to everlasting beauty. And I think that really does say it all. Whatever the 20th century and all the gossip said about Salieri, his own students, the people who knew him, loved him and loved his music. And that is really all it should be. I think a man's reputation should come from his works, not from the idle tittle-tattle of the general public, from pamphlets and plays and movies and films and so on. I think Salieri has been very poorly treated by history, and I hope this little deep dive has done a tiny bit to turn the tide and to convince those of you out there to go out and say, actually, turns out he was probably quite a nice man, got on well with people, a great teacher, a fine composer. And on that, we're going to finish by listening to just the part of the first movement of his Requiem in C minor. And I'd encourage you all to have a listen to it. I've linked to the performance that we're going to hear now in the description. You've got the full score and you can follow it through. We may well do a movement or two on a future classical and trad session. So let's enjoy Salieri's Requiem. We're going to have the first movement, Requiem Aeternam. And what I want to say to you before we start, one of the things I like about this and how it's obviously inspired by Mozart, but it doesn't have the darkness that Mozart's Requiem has. It has a sense of peace. It has a sense of sadness, without doubt. It definitely is a mournful piece, but it doesn't have that fire. It doesn't have that fear, I suppose. It's a work written by a man who'd lived a long life, who had suffered and lost, but had also given so much to the world. So let's have a little bit of Salieri's Requiem. Here we go. So as I've already said, we have very typical Salierian lines, scales and arpeggios, but they're so beautifully placed. And although the choir is moving in a predictable way, this doesn't mean that it's not beautiful music in itself. And without that Mozartian oomph, it's just a beautiful, peaceful Requiem. What this sounds like to my ears is very similar to that Schubert Mass in A flat, and when you consider that Salieri was such an important influence on Schubert's compositional style, you can start to hear this sounds very similar to those beautiful, beautiful works. So everyone, I'm going to draw it to a close here as we're at 3 o'clock. Now, I would really recommend to all of you that you look out for this beautiful, beautiful Requiem. It is very simple. It's not got the inspiration, I suppose, of Mozart, where you're gasping all the way through, but it has a beauty in itself. It has a precision. It has a sense of appropriateness, and I think that is where we're going to bring things to a close today. If you remember that story from when he was a child, that he chastised the priest for being too theatrical. It wasn't appropriate. And although he himself was a composer of opera, and a fine one, a great composer, he always knew what was appropriate. And that in itself was what he did throughout his life, to create music that was appropriate, which got him to where he needed to be. The ultimate safe pair of hands. A composer who could stand in the imperial court, could be relied upon to produce something that was perhaps workmanlike, but was never going to be controversial. The perfect Hofkapellmeister for the emperor. Although it would have been wonderful for Mozart to have achieved that goal of becoming a Kapellmeister, it was never his destiny. He was never stable enough. He was never reliable enough as a musician, really as a person, to have that role. And I think that at the end of the day, that's Salieri's crime, that he was not as flashy and not as inspirational as Mozart. He was that safe pair of hands. And that is, I suppose, why people accused him of being jealous of Mozart. I don't think there's any truth to it, folks. So let's do our best to right the wrongs. Let's do our best to reintegrate Salieri into the pantheon of maybe not great composers, but certainly fine composers. And without doubt, his influence can be heard throughout the 19th century. Without him, Beethoven's music wouldn't sound as it does. Liszt, Schubert, the list goes on. So thank you everyone for being with us. This is the last in the series of Exploring the Great Works. Deep Dives will be back later in the autumn with something different, but I do hope you've enjoyed this little 8-part series. If you've missed any of them, they're all there for you to save and to enjoy. We'll be turning them into podcasts in the autumn, so if you're listening on one of those podcasts, hope you enjoyed it as well. And we'll be seeing you again on Friday for our Fun Friday Sing, where I attempt Lobachevsky by Tom Lehrer and more besides. But for the rest of the day, I hope you have a really good one, everyone. Take care. All the best. Bye-bye.